Hello watch lovers young and old from all corners of the world, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have a fabulous watch on the bench. A late 1960s Universal Genéve Polerouter. Famous as the first production design by Gerald Genta, the Polarouter is perhaps one of the most beautiful dress watches ever made. This is the Polarouter Date. The original crystal is a bit scratched, but it has this very cool trapezoid-shaped cyclops on the underside of the glass. The case back originally had the Polarouter logo, but that is very often very worn on these watches, and someone decided to brush the back instead. It's a little bit of a shame, but nothing to do about that now. We'll see it runs pretty okay on a time grapher. What is interesting is that when I put it in the 9 o'clock up position, all of a sudden the amplitude is higher, but the beat rate is very high. So that's a bit disconcerting, but let's see how it turns out after we service the watch. Inside the watch we have the beautiful and fabulous 169 movement with a Microtor, as they called it. UG and Buren were sort of competing to come up with the first Microtor movement. The benefit of a Microtor, a micro-rotor, is that you can embed it in the movement, so it doesn't have to be anything lying on top of the movement, thereby making it thinner. Now this movement, 69, isn't the best example of that. But they came out with a 66 a few years later in the early 70s. And that movement was 2.5 millimeter thick. And that was actually the record for about 30 years. So there are still quite a few ultra slim Universal Genéve watches out there. Generally in the shadow series, so the white shadow or the golden shadow, etc. Alright, we've gotten down to the calendar works, so let's put this safely in the box. That dial and the case with those twisted lugs, man, that is something else. And as mentioned, this was the first production design of Gerald Genta. He of course later went on to design the Omega Constellation, the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak and so forth. But here's the real kicker. Gerald Genta was 24 years old when he designed this watch. I don't even remember what I did when I was 24 years old, but I'm sure it was slightly less iconic than this. But here's a fun fact. No, sorry. Let me rephrase that. Here's an extremely depressing fact. Humans, or at least men, generally peak at the age of around 25. That's when we're the most creative, when we're most able physically and so forth. And actually a lot of the most famous thinkers came up with their most important theories at a pretty young age. For instance, Einstein, he came up with his theory of relativity when he was 25. We're used to thinking of Einstein as this old guy, but in reality he was actually very young when he did his most famous stuff. And some scientists believe that this is an evolutionary thing so that men could impress women at just the age when they're most physically able. And the most unreasonable part of that explanation is that scientists actually believe that there is an age where men are not idiots. Anyway, we're down to the train. And since we're on a topic of physicists and idiots, let's use the rocket launcher method to take out the second pinion. Whee! Ah, it's nice being an idiot and having science back you up. There are quite a few unusual arrangements in this movement. You see the crown wheel is connected to the ratchet wheel through an intermediary wheel. And this strange looking ratchet wheel on top of the barrel here is actually a clutch as well. Meaning that when you hand wind the watch, there's no force being transferred to the self-winding mechanism. So it saves that a little bit. Perhaps a little bit over-engineered, but a very cool movement. And personally, Universal Genéve is one of my absolute favorite brands. I showed my own personal collection in a couple of videos a little while back, and I have a black Polarouter, and I also have a bicompax. And the brand itself still exists, even though it's not quite the same. So what happened is that during the quartz crisis, UG tried to turn to making quartz watches. At the same time, they were really big in Asia, so they also focused commercially on the Asian market. And they kind of slipped a little bit into obscurity. They were bought by an Asian holding company back in the 90s. And nowadays, I believe UG watches are only sold through a jewelry chain in Hong Kong. So it's a little bit sad. Anyway, we stripped the movement. What you might remember as well is that we had this massive beat error and strangely higher amplitude when the watch was in a vertical position. So I took off the balance wheel. I'm also going to clean the pivots of the balance wheel and see if that helps. What I'm afraid of when I see that is that the pivots might be mushroomed or flattened at the end, which would mean there's more resistance when the watch is horizontal than vertical. But pivots do look fine, so we'll see. And the mainspring looks fine as well. So we're going to reuse it. Just clean the barrel a little bit. And then we can write our signature on the paper. Love, Elvis. The automatic module has one of the tiniest springs ever. One of the thinnest. Be very gentle with the springs that thin. Very easy to deform. And also some tiny little wheels. But with that, we took the whole thing apart. It's not a lot of parts in this watch compared to some of the other ones we worked on. But still, let's get them into the cleaning machine. So we're not going to do a lot with the case. It's in pretty good condition, so let's leave it at that. The crystal, however, is quite scratched, and it is the original, so we're going to try to fix it a little bit. But first, let's clean everything. If you're unfamiliar with the ultrasonic, you might want to brace yourself. Okay, we got the watch movement back from the cleaner. So we first put a little bit of grease at the bottom, and then we're going to put some braking grease along the sides of the barrel. The reason we do this is that in automatic watches, the mainspring slips a little bit inside the barrel when it gets too tight. That is by design, of course, so that you cannot wind the watch too much. And that breaking grease is then to prevent the mainspring from slipping too much or too often. Using this mainspring winder tool. It has a plunger so we can press the mainspring into the barrel. And the access to all kinds of tools is probably the main reason why men like watchmaking. I mean, aside from the obviously very macho image it has and the effect just saying watchmaking has on the other sex. We can clearly see that one of these jewels is much thicker than the other. And when that is the case, then the thick one goes in the top of the movement, so in the balance. You can also see that one of the chatons is gold plated. And that's also a clue that it goes in the balance as well, because that's the only place you can actually see the extra decoration of the gold plating. Now let's see if the balance oscillates freely. That looks nice. So let's proceed with building the movement. What we do is to build a base movement. So basically everything that makes the watch tick. And after that we build the complications. And this watch has two complications. It's the date or calendar complication and the automatic or self-winding complication. So anything that makes the watch more complicated than just showing the time is called a complication. Well, duh! I didn't show that on the video, but this clutch wheel on top of the barrel, I soaked that in Lubetta V105 for reversing wheels. That gives it a little bit of internal lubrication. So I've been thinking, since we basically are going downhill after 25, my wife married me as I was severely on the downslope already. So I guess that makes her the sucker. But then again, every time I look in the mirror, I get reminded that I am on the downslope. And my daughter isn't shy of telling me as well, "You're fat, Papa." But the worst is still my wife. Not that she tells me things, but she just looks too darn good, man. Yes, I'm lucky enough to have a beautiful wife, and even though she's actually pushing 50, she could probably pass for 35. Well, I could pass for 35 plus 50. No, I'm just kidding, of course. Watchmaking really keeps you young. I mean, all the muscular things you have to do with all these heavy parts really keeps you in shape. Anyway, we got into the keyless works, or the winding system, as I think we agreed to start calling it. The keyless works in this movement is quite straightforward. They saved the over-engineering for the train side. But it is really fascinating how much the world has changed when it comes to things like this. Back then, when this watch was new in the late 1960s, this watch would probably cost $60, something like that. I mean, you can get a new Rolex, probably the cheaper ones, for less than $100. And the thing is that labor was just very cheap. And nowadays, of course, in the Western world, the labor is so expensive. So nowadays, you cannot over-engineer things, basically, like they did back then. Talked a little bit about this in the Longines flagship video with a caliber 341 as well. Also a fantastically over-engineered movement that would never ever be made today, and unless it was in a very expensive watch. So we're going to get the pallet fork in place, and then we can put some lubrication on it. Well, not the fork, but on the exit pallet stone. These old movements have 15 teeth on the escape wheel. That's the wheel that meshes with the pallet. So if we oil the pallet stone 3 times and then rotate the escape wheel 5 teeth at a time, that turns out to be approximately 15. All right, moment of truth. Is it cake? And that looks just nice. Beautifully decorated movement, of course. I mean, this whole watch is just a splendor of design. And it actually runs well also. I tried the different positions, and the beat error and the amplitude difference was gone. It was as it should be. So it likely just came down to dirt, which is always nice to see. So with that, we can start building the complications. We're going to do the self-winding mechanism first. And again, have to be very careful with this super thin spring for the click there. So the screws for this module actually go through the plate for the microtor also, so we don't really need to put them in here. We have to take them out again later. But they're going to keep the module together while we put it in. For the microtor itself, it's on a ball bearing. So we're using a Lubetta V106 to lubricate the ball bearing. As you can see as well, the microtor is very thick and bulky. And the reason for that is quite simple physics, not even Einstein level. So you don't even have to be 25 to understand it. But it's simply that the distance from the outer edge of the rotor to the center of it is much smaller. So you need a thicker, heavier weight to make sure it oscillates and breaks the friction of the post. All right, let's put the calendar works back on. As a lot of other watches from this era, the calendar works has a semi-quick set. The way that works is that after the date flips over, you can turn the hands backwards to around 9 o'clock and then forwards again past midnight. And that way you can advance the date. Let's see how that works. There it flipped over. Then we can turn the hands backwards until we see the date almost flip, and then forward again. I'm going to put a little bit of D5 on the jumper. I'm going to rotate it through all the dates. All right, time for the dial. And sorry about this little haze at the top of the frame here. I actually managed to get my work lamp a little bit in the way of the camera. But we see this dial, it's just a beautiful dial. For the hands, we're going to clean them a little bit. We're not going to polish them or anything like this. I'm very much a proponent of keeping vintage watches as original as possible. Maybe that's just a result of having been on a downslope for close to 30 years, but that's my view. Let's see if the date changes over. Come on then. Ah, there it was. Then we can put the minute hand on. And we want the date to flip over between 1/4 and 1/4. That's, let's say, the minimum requirements. And we should be able to get it to within 5 minutes to and fro. All right. With the movement ready, we can turn our attention to the crystal. It was quite scratched, but it is original and difficult to find. And expensive, I might add. So what we're doing is we have this soft cushion underneath, and then we're using a few different grits of sandpaper from rough to fine. And then if needed, we use some Polywash or something similar at the end. So with the crystal nice and shiny again, we're going to press it back into the case. And we'll put the crown and stem into the case just to help us align the date window. And then we use our press to press the crystal into the case. And there we go. And then we can case the movement. And it feels very nice not to have to struggle with all these kinds of issues we've been seeing in the latest few videos. But this is more like most of the watches that I have. They are in good condition, look very nice, and most of the time there are no severe problems, but it is of course fun and very fulfilling as well to work through difficult problems. But it's also nice not to. With the case back on, let's put a nice strap on the watch, and then we can see it on the wrist. There we go. The Universal Genéve Polerouter. Now that is a handsome vintage watch. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. Share it on social media as well. We'll be back shortly with another video. Until then, ta-ta.